Pastor Steve here, and I'd like you to join me for a Bible study. For 3 weeks, we've been looking at how does God work in our lives? How do we understand what it is that He wants us to do? That's obviously a big question in a lot of Christians' lives. So what we're going to do is we're going to pick up our Bibles, we're going to take a look at them. Why not open it up, knock the dust off it for a little bit, and then study this along with me? The title of our study is Destined for Perfection. And today what we're going to talk about is willing obedience. Yes, we're going to go there. So what I want to do is I want to ask you 4 different questions, but they're going to be based off of how do we become willing and obedient in our lives to what God has in store for us. What this is going to do is it's going to set us up for the success that we need so that we can follow along with God in the plan and the purpose that He has for our lives. And if we can do that, then we're going to be able to see that if I'm willing and obedient, then I'm going to eat the good of the land. And in fact, that's Isaiah 119, isn't it? It says, if you are willing and obedient, you shall eat the good of the land. All of us want to eat the good of the land. All of us want the very best of what God wants for us, but there's a condition here. And we have to be willing and we have to be obedient. Now, I recently did this study in Spanish with my wife, and she had a difficult time translating willing and obedient. But it's amazing because here we see that we have to be both a willing and we need to be obedient. Before we can do anything else, we have to be willing. We have to be willing to be able to hear what it is that God has in store for us. And then once we're willing to do these things, then we need to be obedient so that we can accomplish the things that He's called us to do. So let me ask you these 4 questions so that we can prepare ourselves for this study. Now, the first question is how willing are you to pursue what God has in store for you? And does that willingness always lead to success? Now, for every one of us, these questions will, of course, or these answers will be different. All of us have a different answer within our hearts, and that's why these questions are so important. So answer them truthfully, honestly. And in fact, you can download the notes down in the comments below. You can also download the slides down in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe over here on that button. When you subscribe, what's going to happen is that you're going to get all of these notes, you're going to get all of these things every time that we publish them. So don't be afraid to subscribe so that you can hear exactly what's going on in my life and also what I'm teaching here at Friendship Church. Now, the second question that I want to ask you is how obedient are you to what God has told you to do? How does obedience lead you to success? See what I'm doing here? We're checking out willingness and we're checking out obedience. The third question is what are some of the benefits of prompt and willing obedience? You know, a lot of us can be willing and we can obey, but a lot of times we'll put a little condition on it, or we may actually stutter a little bit, or we may go slowly towards what it is that God's called us to do. But is there a benefit to actually doing them quicker than later? Like, I got to ask you that question. The fourth question is what were the results of having obeyed God in your life? Now, I want you to take a look at it. A lot of us have obeyed God in accepting Jesus Christ as our Lord and Savior. That's great. What are the benefits of that? But has God asked you to do something else? Has God told you to go out and lay hands on the sick? And what happened when you laid hands on the sick? So we can see that there is a promise for us if we are obedient in each of these different things. So let's take a look at a couple of scriptures here. While I was down in Panama, one of the things that I realized is that God was speaking to me out of Romans 4:3, and I went there and I looked it up, I read it, and I said, you know what? This has a lot to do with the Old Testament. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to go over to the Old Testament, see where these scriptures were actually at, and see what they meant. Because Paul had an intention behind every single one of his words. And if I can understand and get a deeper understanding by looking at the Hebrew and what that means and what the conditions were, then I'm going to be able to understand what it is that Paul said. So Romans 4:3 says this, for what does the scripture say? Abraham believed God and it was accounted to him for righteousness. Now that's Genesis 15:6. So what we want to do is we want to go back through and want to see how faithful was Abraham, or Abram in this case, to what God had called him to do. You know, a lot of times we say, well, he's the example of faith for us. He's the father of our faith. I can look back and say Abraham was an absolute person that followed exactly what it is that God told him to do, and he did it exactly the way that God told him to do, and we see that God answered every single one of his questions. Well, the problem is that Abraham wasn't very prompt in doing a lot of these promises, or he was at least willing, but was he actually obedient? So what we want to do is we want to take a look at what it was that Abraham did, or in this case, Abram did, so that he could actually have the promises of God fulfilled in his life. And a lot of us will say, well, I know that God's made his promises, and I understand that those things are important for me, but how do I see them come to pass in my life? Because you just haven't seen them come to pass yet. Well, we're going to take a look at that, and we're going to take a look at how Abraham actually delayed the promise of Isaac by more than 25 years. So, and before we go on, though, I want to ask you this question. What are the things that are keeping you from fulfilling what God has called you to do? I'm sure that you know that they are. And what we want to do is we want to take the time today to identify those things. So even throughout the course of the study, go back and write down those things that are prohibiting you from fulfilling what God's called you to do. Because if you can identify them, then you can remove them. So let's take a look at Abraham. Genesis 12:1 says this. Now the Lord had said to Abram, get out of your country, from your family, from your father's house, to the land I will show you. That's pretty simple, right? We all believe that Abraham just packed everything up and said, okay, Lord, I'm on my way, and he heads out to Canaan. Well, the reality is that he was in Haran. Abraham's father, Nahor, was actually the one that was told to go to Canaan. And he goes up to what is now modern day Turkey in Haran, and he sets up camp and he says, you know what, this is pretty good. I think I'll stay here. God had told him to go and do something, and yet he didn't do that. And then God reaches out to Abram and he says, look, your father's not doing this. I want you to get up from your country, leave your family, that's important, and your father's house to the land I will show you. So Abram, you know what he did? He waited till his father died. That's in Acts 7:4. If we look at the testimony of Stephen before he was stoned. And what it tells us is that Abram was told to go and do these things, but he didn't leave until his father had died. So a lot of times what we'll do is we'll put off the promises of God until something comes to pass in our lives. How long does that keep you from actually accomplishing what God has called you to? What if Abram had gone when he was 25 or 30 or 35? All of this would have been all set aside, and he could have actually accomplished all these things much sooner and would have had a much longer time to enjoy Isaac, and Sarah would have had more time to enjoy Isaac. There's so many different ways that we can look at this, but Abram actually delayed the hand of God in his life because he had the promise. He was willing to do it. He just was not obedient until his father died. And now he's at the age of 75. How soon could he have achieved those things if he had moved just a little bit earlier? So based on this story, I want to ask you this question. What does obedience look like to you? What does partial obedience look like? You know, partial obedience, is that still partial disobedience? I mean, it's one or the other, isn't it? So a lot of times what we'll do is we'll get involved in this whole partial obedience thing, and we're willing to do it, and yet that obedience thing still comes up and it haunts us because we never fully expand or feel it fully go into what it is that God has called us to do. And it's a matter of faith, isn't it? So the next thing I want to show you is this. So Abram finally shows up. He goes down to Canaan, and guess what? God's sitting there waiting for him. A lot of times God will call us to go to a place where he's going to wait for us and give us the next bit of instructions. And that's exactly what happened. So in Genesis 12:7, it says this. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your descendants I will give this land. And there he built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. Abram is worshiping the Lord here. He's gone out and he said, okay, God, you've given me a promise. This is the land that you promised to give me. I'm going to set up an altar. How many of us have done that? We said, hey, Lord, you know what? You made this promise to me. I'm going to worship you. I'm going to serve you, and I'm going to go ahead and do this. And yet, you know what happens? All of a sudden, a famine hits Canaan. And what does Abram do? He leaves the land that God had given to him. He leaves it and he goes down to Egypt. And we know what happens in Egypt. He goes down there and he lies about Sarah not being his wife. And Pharaoh says, hey, I'm going to bring her into my harem. And then all of a sudden, all heck breaks loose. And Pharaoh finds out, and what does he do? He kicks Abram out of Egypt. So we have to take a look at this. We want to ask ourselves this question. What kind of faith will you have to have if you're expecting something from God and then all of a sudden difficulty arises? Can we maintain our faith in God and the promises that he's given to us and yet still face adversity and difficulty? And a lot of us will do that. A lot of us will say, well, I'm going through difficulty. I'm going through a trial here. This can't be the will of God because it's not easy. Well, that's not the way that we determine God's will being easy. It's about having peace about it. But if we look at the life of Moses, if we look at the life of Paul, if we look at the life of Jesus Christ, they all went through difficulties. They all went through trials. They all fully met what it was that God intended for them, and yet all the difficulties and trials that they went through were still there. So what I want to do is I want to take you 10 years further into the past. So Abram's already put off God's plan for him by another 10 years. Genesis 15:5. Then he brought him outside and said, look now towards heaven and count the stars if you're able to number them. And he said to him, so shall your descendants be. God shows Abram the stars in the sky, and he says, you know what, you're going to have this many descendants. And Abram says, wow, that's really great, Lord, let's have a covenant about that. So what they do is they go out, they split the animals, remember this part, and the smoking pot goes between them, and they make this covenant. Abraham has a covenant with God. And he goes out and he says, you know what, I'm going to follow God. I'm going to do what he says. I've even got this covenant of blood here with these sacrificed animals. And then he goes and he has Ishmael. So he fully goes against what God had planned. He doesn't have a child with Sarah. He has a child with his wife's servant, in fact. And we see that he didn't fully obey God. He just kind of partially obeyed God. And he created all kinds of problems with that. And what happens? He still has a covenant with God. Remember, he had a sacrifice. Now he has a covenant of blood with God. And he still delayed God because he's still 85 years old. We're looking 15 years from now when Isaac is yet to be born. So he's already delayed things another 15 years. So what we want to do is we want to ask ourselves, what is the best way for us to help God? And is there a way that we can help God, or do we just need to believe? So what we want to do is we want to make sure that we're following God, that we're helping him in this way, that we're willing and that we're obedient. But also I want to ask you the question, what has happened in the past when you've tried to help in the past? Have you screwed it up? Have you helped God at all? I mean, you want to ask yourself these questions because God tells us that human effort doesn't amount to anything. It's by the power of the Spirit that we can do all things. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that we rely on the Holy Spirit. We want to rely on what God's promises are. You know, now 14 years later, God shows up again. He says, hey, Abram, how you doing? And then he talks to him in this, and he says this in Genesis 17:4 and 5. As for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be a father of many nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be called Abraham. And then he gives him the covenant of circumcision. So we look at this covenant and we say, now this is really, he's got skin in the game now, literally. And he's going through this covenant, and God says, look, I'm going to give you a son. And in fact, he even promises him, he says, in a year, I'm going to make sure that you do have a son. And Abram goes out and he immediately obeys God, and Isaac is born. Well, no, that's not really what happened. What Abram did was he went down to link up with Abimelech in his country, and he tells Abimelech, hey, you see that lady over there? That's my sister. And Abimelech says, I'm going to make her my wife. So Abram is already endangering this covenant that God had already given to him. This had to have been within the first 3 months of this original covenant. So if you look at this covenant closely, we can say, wait a second, he had the sacrifice. Remember that when he first got to Israel? Then he had the covenant of the sacrificed animals. 14 years later, then another 14 years later, we see that he has this covenant with God and the covenant of circumcision, and he still almost blows it. So I want to ask you this question. What are some of the ways we can slow down God's promises in our lives? What are some of the ways that we can facilitate their accomplishment? So we really want to take a look at what's slowing us down and what can actually speed this up. And if you can answer those questions, then you'll be able to find that God will really truly work in your life. Genesis 20:17. Finally, look at what happens. So Abram prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, his wife, and his female servants, and they bore children. So this is really key because we see that Abram now is helping somebody else out, and he follows what God tells him to do. He tells him to pray for Abimelech because not only Abimelech's wife, but all of his female servants, all of their wombs were shut up. And yet Abram goes and prays for him for their wombs to be open. And what happens? Sarah becomes pregnant. So look at what's happening here. When we're obedient to what God tells us, when we're willing to what he has in store for us, then what we can see is that his promises will soon be fulfilled in our lives. So the question for this particular scripture is what are some of the ways that we can serve others to facilitate the fulfillment of God's promises in our lives? We want to go out, we want to be able to serve. If we're looking for God to do something in our lives, why not do something for someone else that is looking for basically the same thing. If somebody's looking for a car, make a car payment for them. If somebody's having difficulty with their children, then why not ask to take care of, to help take care of them while they and their wives go out and have a date or do something special. I mean, there's so many different ways that we can do this, but if we reach out willingly to the people who need the help, then the help that we provide for others will actually be provided for us. For so whatsoever you sow, right? So those are the important things that we can see. Now we're looking at Abraham, and we see that these promises were delayed by up to 25 years, and they could have been delayed by up to 50 years because Abram was not willing to go to where God wanted him to be. And when he finally does it, God meets him there and then takes him to the next step. So we look at that and we say, wow, Abraham wasn't really filled with faith, and yet he was still in the Faith Hall of Fame, wasn't he? We see Hebrews 11:17. It says, by faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises offered up his only begotten son. So we see that Abraham was actually willing to give up Isaac, but God put him in a position where he said, I want you to offer me Isaac as a sacrifice. He either could obey or he couldn't disobey. And in this case, or he would disobey. The thing is that you can't just do a partial sacrifice. This is a whole sacrifice. This is a whole thing. And so what we want to do is we want to take a look at this and say, wait a second, Abram finally did what it was that God told him to do. And he's already 125 years old, 130 years old, based off of where we see Sarah dying and where we see this sacrifice of Isaac. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that we're following what it is that God has in store for us. And this willing obedience to do these things will actually make a huge difference in our lives. So we want to take a look at the situations in our lives that God has asked you to obey him in, and what has happened when he's given you no choice but to obey. What actually happened when you obeyed? What happened maybe when you didn't obey? Maybe things just kind of fell apart. Maybe things aren't working for you. Maybe things have slowed down a little bit. So willing obedience is extraordinarily important. So this is the end of this teaching, but I encourage you to follow along with this exercise that I have for you. And you can put it on pause when I ask each of these different questions, but don't forget, you can download the notes down below in the comments section, and when you do, you can actually follow along with us, and you can do this at your own speed. And in fact, you can even carry this on and do this study with some other people together, just so that you can actually follow what it is that God has in store for you, and actually learn from others as you go along. So these questions are going to be based on Romans 12:1. And it says, and so, dear brothers and sisters, I plead with you to give your bodies to God because of all he has done for you. Let them be a living and holy sacrifice, the kind he will find acceptable. This is truly the way to worship him. This is what we're talking about as far as willingness goes. So the first exercise is this. What I want you to do is I want you to define in your own words what willing obedience looks like. If you can define what willing obedience looks like, then what's going to happen is that you're actually going to be able to be more willing and be more obedient, because you're going to know exactly what that means. You can look it up in the dictionary if you want, but I encourage you to search your mind, ask God to give you a definition of what willing obedience is, and you're going to find that it'll make a huge difference. So the second exercise, what I'd like you to do is to list the things that you believe God has told you to do, but you have not yet done them yet. And what we can do is we're going to write down these things that we believe that God's called us to do, and we haven't yet accomplished them yet. And then next to each one of those, you may have 3, you may have 4. What I encourage you to do is write down the reasons why you haven't done them. So what we're doing here is we're identifying the reasons why we haven't yet accomplished what God has done. Maybe it's fear, maybe it is worry, maybe it's doubt, maybe it's well, I just have to wait for something else to happen in my life. I need to see that God's going to work in my life. What are the reasons why? And if we can identify these reasons and we can eliminate them one by one, and we can start going out and saying, that is no longer an excuse. I'm going out and I'm accomplishing what God has for me. The third exercise is this. How can you change the way that you think so you can accomplish those things that God has asked you to do? So what we want to do is we want to identify these negative thoughts that we have, and we want to start identifying the positive thoughts that we can follow along, and then we can start going to those positive thoughts and start thinking these things that God has in store for us. You can find the negative things by basing it on what are your negative habits. If you've got negative habits, they're usually triggered by something that you've thought or something that you've had on your heart or on your mind. Say, well, I'm just going to go to Facebook for just about 5 minutes here, and I'm just going to start scrolling. And 3 hours later, you see that you're still scrolling and say, oh man, I wasted the whole day. So what we want to do is we want to identify these things that we can actually change in the way that we think and start saying, wait a second, no, I'm spending time in the Word today. No, I'm going to fast today. No, I'm going to spend some time with God today, rather than spending all my time on Instagram or Facebook or TikTok or wherever it is that you go. So the next question that I have is, we want to list the small steps that you can start taking to move toward what God's perfect will is in your life. We've already identified a lot of things that will actually help us to be willing, and if we can be obedient and start taking those small, tiny steps, guess what's going to happen? God's going to start showing up, and he's going to start working with you, and you're going to start seeing, wait a second, there's the hand of God right there. There's the promise being fulfilled. I can follow this along. We see that every single time that Abraham did it, he was actually able to fulfill what God called him to do. We saw 4 different steps, and there are probably many more that we're not aware of, but 4 small little steps where we see that Abram and then Abraham actually went out and reached out to God and said, okay, God, this is what I want to do. And then he does the next step. So that's where we want to be. I encourage you to share these videos. You're more than welcome to share them on Facebook. You can download them on YouTube. I encourage you to start doing a Bible study. Don't forget to subscribe over there in the corner. And by all means, don't leave a comment down in the bottom. Let us know how these studies are changing your life. If you found something else in this about willing obedience, put it in the comments. We all encourage you to do those things. In the meantime, start looking forward to the next study. And in the meantime, why not be a miracle going slow?